Well, hello, all you degenerate heathens. Today we have some very juicy attempts to justify what's supposed to be presupposed, which defeats the entire point of presupposing something, doesn't it? This is apparently an audio clip of Greg Banson. I don't know who this is, but damn is he in tough competition with my worn-out flip-flops for highest IQ. Anyway, let's see what he has to say about presuppositional apologetics.
That isn't the presuppositionalist argument. The argument is you're reasoning in a circle, and it's a destructive circle. And I may be
So this destructive circle versus virtuous circle is a load of BS, and you hear it all across the presup world. It's a meme that they repeat like the parrots that they are. It's just a dishonest rhetoric. There's no way to justify circular reasoning, period. End of story. It's a fallacy no matter what the context is.
reasoning in a circle, but it's one which encompasses your thought and everything valid in your thought as well as all other things. It gives science a foundation. Now this word about presupposition
It absolutely does not give science a foundation at all. He tries to justify it by saying that his circle encompasses everything happening in the non-believer's destructive circle. There we go. Just for visual aid. As if this somehow absolves them of the fallacy. If I have an assertion, and I back that up with an even larger circular assertion to explain or justify it, I've done nothing. I've just kicked the can down the road. If you simply assert that the Bible is the Word of God because the Bible tells us so, and the Bible is right because it's the Word of God, and I tell you that that's circular reasoning, your premises rest on nothing but each other. And your response is that God created the Bible because God exists, and we know because He created the Bible, and we know because God exists. Well, whatever. If you're using a circular reasoning to justify circular reasoning, like above that, well, all we're doing is kicking the can down the road. We haven't actually solved anything. You've just expanded the problem. It's still resting on nothing. Q. Otangelo, we don't need an explanation of the explanation. You don't get a foundation to reasoning just by adding more and more fallacies that encompass smaller fallacies. That just makes it worse.
Now this word about presuppositional and circular argumentation needs to be expanded just a bit more. Let us say that I, as a Christian, am dealing with a man who is a committed and exhaustive empiricist. He believes that sense...
Okay, so we're going with a committed and exhaustive, strict empiricist. Something almost no one is actually committed to, so great. Basically a straw man out of the gate. Ironically, this is the position a presup must be committed to, since they rely on so-called personal revelation of God, which by definition can only be a sense experience, but not a regular sense experience. That can be measured with objective tools or tested against others' experiences. No, of course not. Their special revelation relies on the single least reliable form of sense experience.
Perception is the test of all truth whatsoever. All right, so his ultimate presupposition is that sense perception is the standard of truth. Now consider a man who wants to debate with the empiricist at this point. And he brings an argument, we'll call it argument A, to bear on the empiricist. And another man comes into the room and he uses argument B with the empiricist. Now, if argument A is in fact predicated on an ultimate presupposition which denies that sense perception is the standard of truth, and the empiricist buys argument A, would you please notice that he can only buy that argument by rejecting his presupposition? That is, he can't buy that argument and keep his presupposition, because this is predicated on the denial of that as the ultimate standard of truth. On the other hand, if somebody arguing on the basis of sense perception being...
Okay, so this is... Wow, this is really, really stupid. All he said was that if an empiricist buys an argument that denies empiricism, they've just contradicted themselves. Yet, he's acting like this is somehow what happens in all cases when someone doesn't presuppose his version of his specific regional God.
The standard of truth goes along as his argument, and the empiricist buys it. He buys it because he's already committed to sense perception as being the standard of truth. Now, nobody's talking about what is...
He buys it because it conforms to his presupposition? How can you be saying so many words that mean absolutely nothing? Yeah, if someone buys an argument because it contains their assumptions, then yes, they'd buy that argument. The point being, nothing. There's no point to that. All he said was, if someone buys an argument that contradicts their commitments, then they're contradicting themselves. And if they buy an argument that does conform to their assumptions, well, nothing. He's just pointing out he bought it because it conforms to his assumptions. This is such an empty... Oh my God.
Now, nobody's talking about what has been referred to by R.C. as the elementary logical fallacy of circular reasoning. Nobody says A is true because A is true. We're talking about transcendental thinking, and that's a very...
You say God is true because God is true.
Very important area of epistemology. It goes far beyond elementary Greek logic, far beyond Humean empiricism. And in fact, if anything, it has its roots in what is really the continental tradition of Kant, of asking about the preconditions of all knowledge, be it logic or sense perception or whatever.
See, this is how precepts conflate epistemology with ontology. He just called this transcendental thinking epistemology. Then he went on to say that it's about preconditions of all knowledge, aka the nature of intelligibility itself, aka ontology. Knowledge being epistemological, but the preconditions being ontological. Sound familiar?
Because God is revelatory. He's always truth revealing. Okay, and he's secured
And how do
the
you
fact
know
that we
that
can
is
know
true?
things to be the case. Because God's revealed it to be the case. God's the basis of my epistemology.
No, yeah, well, the ultimate part. Why should I accept that the mind is ultimate?
Because if there is no ultimate, then there is, or metaphysical, ultimate I just take to be like a metaphysical primary reality. Then there is no basis. The entire world, anything that you would assert would be rendered unintelligible and meaningless.
Why?
The contrary, if there is no ultimate foundation or frame of reference to appeal to, then to appeal to things like truth would be meaningless. Because metaphysics deals with the nature of reality. Or revelatory. Revelatory requires God being relational, and God being relational requires God being some sort of a mind, a conscious being. Like rocks are not
Yeah,
relational.
why does
Okay.
why does that follow?
Why does what follow?
That God has to be a mind or revelatory or relational for us to have knowledge.
Because so God grounds not only our ontology, the ontological, which is just established that there's a foundational rhyme and reason to everything. But the fact that we can know things, our epistemology. So God grounds both of them. Okay.
Yeah, and
So
just in
the
terms of
reason
epistemology.
why God's required for our epistemology, I'm going to show another reductio now. Okay, so the world where you're trying to establish truth, right? But you don't have access to that which is metaphysically primary. You're epistemically in the same position as someone who adopts a worldview where there is no metaphysical reality. Because we're not talking about proximate facts. We're talking about the metaphysical. Well, we're talking about the metaphysical reality, the nature of what it even means to be a fact. That 1 + 1 = 2. So God grounds not only our ontology, the ontological, which is just established that there's a foundational rhyme and reason to everything. But the fact that we can know things, our epistemology. So because we're not talking about proximate facts, we're talking about the metaphysical. Well, we're talking about the metaphysical reality, the nature of what it even means to be a fact. God's the basis of my epistemology.
And what the presuppositionalist says is you must recognize that an ultimate standard is just that, ultimate. And if you have an argument for that...
Except you don't even know what your standard is for. The standard by which all natures of all things is contingent upon, aka ontology, or the standard for how we assess truth value of propositions, aka epistemology. Which is it?
When you use the word standard, it seems to imply a measurement, a standard against which you can measure truths. It makes no sense if we're talking about ontological truth to call something a standard. There's only what an object is and what its nature is defined by. For this, you should use the word source or something like that.
And if you have an argument for that ultimate standard that is other than the ultimate standard, then that other argument is your ultimate standard. You understand that you can't establish your ultimate point by going behind it. Because if you could go behind it to find some grounds for it there, that would be your ultimate standard. And so then the question is...
Okay. The ultimate standard for what truth is, ontologically, is simply what reality is. But precepts conflate how we know what truth is for what truth is. So notice how he's talking about going behind the ultimate standard makes that thing the actual ultimate standard of reality. What he means by going behind it is to find some grounds for it is some justification or explanation of that ultimate standard. If you could explain the standard, then that explanation is the actual standard. But here's the problem. So he's taking the nature of truth itself, the standard, and conflating it with how we explain or how we know what truth is. So you have the ultimate standard of reality X, be it the laws of logic or God or whatever governs the nature of all reality and intelligibility, etc. Okay, but I can, quote, go behind it and explain the way we know this is we start with the brute fact of observations. I observe stuff. I can observe patterns in what I observe, and I can compare and contrast past and present sense experience with future predictions, and I can compare and contrast past and present sense experience, and I can compare that with future predictions. I can also compare sense experience of other people. From here, I can test the intelligibility of the patterns of human language of logic. And this whole process is not circular at all. It establishes preconditions for intelligibility, and it also establishes epistemological methods, all without circularity. It isn't sense experience that is the ultimate standard, though it is the base standard. Instead, the scientific method is the ultimate standard, despite the fact that it rests upon or has behind it a whole process of cross-confirmations and comparisons and systematic categorization and iterative reiterations. But that just establishes how humans and animals come to know things. None of this is behind the actual nature of the truth, yet we can use this process to justify our knowledge of what the ultimate truth may be. And yet at no point must we commit circular reasoning.
Behind it to find some grounds for it there, that would be your ultimate standard. And so then the question is, well, how do you argue for this? And the fact is the only way...
See, they aren't capable of distinguishing epistemology from ontology. He's asking now, how do you argue for the ultimate standard, meaning epistemology? How do we know it? But he's also using this ultimate standard as a presupposition or a premise in order to get to that ontological claim that it is the standard of truth and reality. God is. But it's also an epistemological standard, an epistemological method for coming to truth. Pure and simply a destructive circle.
And the fact is the only way you can argue is in a way consistent with your presuppositions. And the only way you can establish your presuppositions is transcendentally. And that is circular argumentation. It has nothing to do with the flatline circularity of begging the question.
Thanks for watching.
The cope is so real. My circle is good, while yours is bad. Oh, the desperation, it's palpable. I can taste it. The only way you can argue is to be consistent with your presuppositions. That's what he said. No. Whereas serious people who actually care about proper epistemology don't engage in circular reasoning, or don't have to. These people think that circular reasoning is just an insurmountable problem that everyone is plagued by, and that it can in fact be a good way to know things. Problem is, you could just pick any random presupposition and just make every argument consistent with it, which is just empty begging the question by definition. I can insert any presupposition and it would rest on just as much as this transcendental argument does. Nothing. They want to try and pigeonhole everyone else into this same fallacy. They know that they have to commit it, since they know they have no evidence for God, and then they'll try and shift the burden of proof and try and point out that their opponent is contradicting their own presuppositions. Problem there is, we don't have to argue from presuppositions. Also, they have to contradict their own presuppositions in order to remotely begin to justify it, making precept to be one of the most viciously circular arguments there is. Let alone somehow a better circular argument. They're not even consistent with their own presuppositions, since their ultimate standard of God contradicts with their justification of God by personal revelation, meaning sense experience is simultaneously their ultimate standard. Okay, so their sense experience of God is consistent with their presupposition of God, right? Okay, well, the mere fact that they have to ground knowledge of God in any sense experience is contradicting their method of presupposition. The mere fact that they arrive at a certain presupposition for any reason at all contradicts their entire method and verifies mine. It is a flatline circularity of begging the question. They assume God in the premise in order to obtain God as a conclusion. No, you don't get to just say that your circular reasoning isn't begging the question when you, one, admit that it's circular and all circular arguments are fallacies no matter what, and two, precepts/transcendental argument for God is literally begging the question. It exists solely as a way to provide an argument for God without providing any evidence of God, so it necessarily takes the form of saying that God is part of the premise and also the conclusion. It takes the form necessarily of saying that God made knowledge, and we know we have knowledge because God, therefore God. God exists, therefore there's a basis for knowledge, and therefore we can know God exists. These are the essential precept arguments forms, and it is the pure fusion of epistemology and ontology. Ontological claim that God exists, therefore knowledge exists, therefore epistemologically we can know God exists. Or ontological claim that God exists and that knowledge exists, ontological claim that only God can provide knowledge, therefore we can epistemologically know knowledge exists, therefore ontologically and epistemologically God exists. Premise of God, conclusion of God. Snake's law holds all theist arguments are fallacious or otherwise unsound. Now the comments for this are absolute gold, but let's just take a look at this in here. Presuppositional argument is perfectly linear, not circular, and I don't know why some presuppositional apologists say that it's circular. The argument, well, it's because it is. The argument always begins with God and ends with something else, such as God, therefore logic.
God, therefore morality. God, therefore reasoning. Each of those arguments is linear, not circular. Okay, sorry dude, but those arguments are designed solely to conclude God. So you're lying, you're leaving that part out. He goes on to say, it never starts with God and ends with God, which would look like this. God, therefore logic, therefore God. That is actually what you do, though. Because these are not arguments for logic and morality and reasoning. All of these arguments, the moral argument for God, the transcendental argument for God, which is presuppositional apologetics, are all arguments for God. This is not true what you're saying. So then he ends saying that argument would be circular, but that argument is not presuppositional apologetics. Presuppositional apologetics always follows the linear format in the three above. No, it does not. Because that is not the end goal. All these people, Darth Dawkins, Jay Robin, Matt Slick, Greg, whatever his name is, Greg Banson, I think, none of these people are simply creating the transcendental argument for God or the presuppositional argument. They're not doing it for the end goal of just establishing that logic and morality and reasoning exist. They are doing it so that they can argue for God. They don't care about logic or reasoning or morality for any other reason other than saying that God is the only possible author for these things. This is pure dishonesty. I mean, with the knowledge that these are actually arguments for God, this couldn't be a more perfect textbook example of circular reasoning and begging the question. The precept argument for God, aka presuppositional apologetics, aka transcendental argument for God, is an argument for God, meaning the entire point is to conclude that God exists. So yes, it is God, therefore logic, therefore God. Yet they literally claim, as a presupposition, that God exists. Fallacy, thy name is presuppositional apologetics. Basically, they want to ignore soundness of an argument. They don't want to justify their premises and really just use the conclusion to justify the premise. It's also affirming the consequent at best, in that A therefore B, B therefore A is fallacious in its very structure. God therefore logic, logic exists therefore God,
is fallacious.
Because the argument ignores multiple possible causes to logic. The failure of most apologetics is that they want absolute confirmation without any possibility of doubt, but they can't get it since they just have to trust their senses that they're picking up a God, and they have to have blind trust that their God exists and is correct. They have to rely on the same brute facts as everyone else, but precepts deny this fact and thus actually have it worse than what they accuse the non-believer of, since they just stop at blind trust in something and never improve their ability to assess facts, let alone the real facts. The strength of science is that it can be corrected, because if you just use the method of assuming you're 100% correct because you obey a God who you just assume exists and is 100% correct and can never be wrong, you can never find out if you're wrong. The fact is simply that they don't want to have actual arguments for God, so they try and shift the burden of proof onto us. And what that ends up doing is they have to admit that everything is circular. Then we have to justify how we know anything at all. The other thing is that they don't want anything. They don't want God to be contingent upon anything. And yet their God is clearly governed by the actual ultimate source of reality, which would be something like the laws of logic. And the way you can prove this to any precept is by asking them, well, if they take any questions, that is by asking them if their God could justify torturing babies. If their God's nature
was to torture babies, would that make him good? They would answer, no, my God could never have a nature to torture babies, and therefore you have them. The mere fact that something could not be in God's nature means that something is defining God's nature, which means that God is contingent upon that thing. Now, since morality is objective and a purely logical pursuit, that thing of goodness would be based in logic. Well, folks, it's time. You have to go down. It is your patriotic duty. Go down to your local police station and fill out a report because you just witnessed a murder. Thanks for watching, and as always,
Dog bless.